In 8 days, New Hanover County's commissioners are scheduled to vote on whether to explore the sale of New Hanover Regional Medical Center, our region's largest employer and the centerpiece of our healthcare community. We have with us today Chris Coudray, New Hanover County's manager, and John Gizdick, New Hanover Regional Medical Center's president and CEO, to talk about why this is being considered now, what a potential sale would mean for the quality and cost of healthcare in our region, and what options may be considered if the commissioners decide to move forward with this process. They are joined on stage today by Business Journal editor Vicki Janowski, who will ask them questions, and we will also take questions from the audience. If you have one, please text it in to the number that's in your program. It's 910-264-8955. Make sure you include your name and table number with your text. We will get a microphone to as many people as possible so you can ask your question directly to the panelists. I'll now hand it over to Vicki.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Chris and John, for joining us. Obviously, there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions that are still swirling around this issue since it came up. So we don't normally have a power breakfast on Mondays. This time we did with the scheduling. So I thought the best thing I could do for you guys is throw a bunch of stats at you first thing Monday morning. But bear with me for just a second. So UNCW, a couple years ago, they did a study on New Hanover Regional's economic impact for our area. And they found that NHRMC, in just the Tri-County area, not even counting the other counties where it has services in, equals to about 11% of economic activity for just our 3 counties. So that's 11% of our economy is based on New Hanover Regional. And this study was done back in 2012 when they only had 5,000 employees. And today they have 7,000 employees roughly, which makes them far and away the largest employer in our area. So this whole discussion is coming around a time where consolidations and mergers and acquisitions in the healthcare industry is not just only being discussed here, but around the country. I saw a stat, between 98 and 2015, there were about 1,400 hospital mergers in the US. So this is happening against the context of obviously a lot of changes in the healthcare industry. All you have to do is turn on the national news or listen to the upcoming, any of the presidential debates that you already heard, and you see how much it's dominating our national conversation. And just one more stat before we jump into questions, and like Rob was saying, we want to get to as many questions as possible from you guys, because I know they're already stacking up. This is healthcare, so when we're talking about a merger, an acquisition, and ownership change, the product that we're talking about is a very individualized personal product, right? So NHRMC last year, between its inpatients, its ERs, its physician group, saw about 800,000 patients. So there's a very good chance that even if you are not directly involved in the healthcare industry, that you or someone in your family has a vested interest in the quality of healthcare here on a very personal level. So for all those reasons, obviously this was the natural topic for this session for the Power Breakfast. And before we dive really into the details, I wanted to start off with a question to John and kind of take a broad look at this, because, and we'll talk more about this later, but it's an unusual situation that we still have a county-owned hospital, but that means it's a public asset, which means we have a much more public process and input in this particular decision, which is why I think there's been so much input, because people feel that the stakes are high on this one, right? So we go broad and big picture. My first question for you, John, is there's been a lot of discussion on these challenges that are coming in and possibly impacting the hospital and the healthcare system. So with everything that's been discussed in recent weeks, do you think an independent county-owned hospital like New Hanover Regional can survive and grow in the coming decades?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it's a question we've wrestled with for 52 years here in New Hanover County. When you look at nationally the fact that 70% of hospitals are now part of health systems, if you get outside of hospitals, insurance companies have consolidated even more than healthcare systems. And so, right, wrong, or indifferent, it is becoming about scale in our country. It's the reason there are no more mom and pop hardware stores, or very, very few in town, when you have Lowe's and Home Depot and Walmart. And so, is it impossible for an independent county-owned hospital? I don't think it's impossible. I do think the challenges will continue to mount, and as the industry continues to change, we're going to be in the boat rowing alone, and that makes for a much more difficult journey. It's a journey we've been on that we've been able to successfully navigate over the last many years. And I think as we look at that future, from my perspective, the reason we're sitting here is about asking a question and planning for that future, not making a decision, but making sure we've got all the information and options in front of us, just like we have every time we've done a strategic plan, to understand what the future looks like, what we might need to be successful in that future, and how we keep delivering the exceptional care we provide every day.
And Chris, I have more of a process question. So September 3rd, from the very day that the announcement came out, has been kind of the date that's been mentioned as the first step if an RFP goes forward. So the questions that have come up around that is, why now? Why September 3rd? What does September 3rd actually represent? I think, you've mentioned several times, and I think John's mentioned several times, it's non-binding. This is not the contract to sell. But I think there's been questions about why now, that particular date? Also, what does it kick off? If you move forward, does that mean the genie's out of the bottle? And then also, what actually will be asked that day?
Thank you for the question, and thank y'all for putting this Power Breakfast on. I want to start out by acknowledging putting the question before the board has opened up a lot of passion, a lot of emotion. It's added to uncertainty in an industry that already faces lots of uncertainty. And that's unfortunate, but I think it is absolutely necessary if we want to continue to take the long-term view for the hospital. And can we have a hospital, to be perfectly honest, that doesn't carry local tax subsidy? If we do, maybe that's okay, but heretofore the model has been we don't want to do that. And so that's why we're asking the question. Specifically about the process, September the 3rd, we wanted to put it on an agenda whereby we gave plenty of opportunity for the community to hear and understand what the question is. There was nothing magical about September the 3rd. There's no triggering event in the course of the hospital, but through the discourse that John and I have on a regular basis, regular discussions with boards of county commission members, the boards of trustees, John and I came to the point this summer that if the hospital is at its very best that it's ever been, and we want to explore a potentially different kind of ownership model in the future, we need to move that ball forward. So we announced on July 23rd what our ask on September the 3rd was going to be. There was nothing magical about that. Just the time that John and I spend working together, evaluating, briefing the boards that we work for about the state of healthcare, what that uncertainty is, led us to publishing the information. That's how we ended up where we are.
So if it's not pegged to anything, is there any drawbacks to delaying that decision, as some groups in the community have asked for?
So for me, the question would be, if we don't have a vote on September the 3rd, and that's for the county commission to decide, what happens over the course of the next 90 days? What is the intent? Because September 3rd is only the beginning of a very open, deliberate, transparent process. We cannot go forward unless the board says proceed. So if the board decides to table, and that is absolutely their prerogative, I don't know what we do in the intervening 90 days other than to continue to add to the uncertainty for 7,000 professionals who work at the hospital. What is the county commission going to decide to do? If someone could very clearly articulate what that 90 days or 120 days, whatever the ask is, what are we going to achieve different than what we've been doing for the past 6 weeks? I'd like to understand that. So that would be my response.
Okay. I'm going to toss it over to Rob. I think he's been fielding some of the audience questions.
First question's table 43, Dave.
Yes, good morning. My name's Dave Hoff. When I first heard the announcement of what we're talking about today, my initial reaction was, what problem are we solving? And I still, I understand that I heard what you said about the hospital being in the very best shape that it's ever been, and so on and so forth. And I also know that once we ring the bell, and the bell has been rung, what the impact is. I've been in organizations that were sold, acquired, so on and so forth. So that we're down that road. But my question is, what problem is selling the hospital going to solve?
So thank you for that question. I'll jump in, and certainly if you've got thoughts. So let me start by just clarifying. Selling is not the only option. And the resolution, while called a resolution of intent to sell, that is the title of the state statute, that does not mean that is the only option. And so exploring different structures going forward is what we're talking about, one of which could include sale, but there are many, many other types of structures and models that could be proposed and that we would want to understand as part of that process, and that is the point about getting information and options so we know what they might be. More directly to your question, that I think is part of the issue here. We're always looking to solve a problem, and when you ask the question in good times, nobody wants to understand how you can ask it when right now we have no problems. I mean, generally speaking, things are going well. We want to preserve what we have. We have a very good thing in New Hanover Regional Medical Center, in this medical community, and in healthcare in our region. We want that to continue. I want that to continue. Believe me, if I could wave a magic wand and nothing would ever change and we could be in our bubble here in southeastern North Carolina forever, that would be fantastic. But that is unfortunately not the case. And so as we look at the future of healthcare, and so while problems or challenges, the future of healthcare is this: the current model is broken. It is unaffordable and unsustainable for our country. I'm sure none of you are going to raise your hand and say, I'm not paying enough for healthcare. Anyone? Right? And so the model has to change. That started with the Affordable Care Act, of really changing the model of healthcare and moving away from fee-for-service and volume-driven to value-driven. Medicare quickly followed that, and they are independent of the Affordable Care Act. And Medicare is really driving it even more so than the Affordable Care Act at this point. And so as we move towards that new future model of healthcare, where it is about improving your health and the health of the community and delivering value, higher quality at a lower cost, while at the same time we live today in a fee-for-service world where 90% of our business is still the old model. Our volumes continue to grow. We have to continue to invest in the facilities to address that growth. It's preparing for that transition. It's making sure that as our community continues to grow, we can provide the resources and the care you need in the current model while preparing for that new future model of health care that will be different than what we've ever done before. None of us have ever done that. None of us have been through that in healthcare. We don't know what that transition looks like, what is on the other side of that transition. And so this is really an opportunity for us to continue to plan ahead like we have for many, many years to make sure we're proactive and have options in front of us to make sure we make the best decisions on the future of healthcare for southeastern North Carolina.
I'd like to add to that if I could. I think that's a great question. And I want to emphasize what John said. Neither of us are advocating to the county commission to sell the hospital. That's just not what we're advocating for. We're asking the board to follow the statutory process. And so the problem that ultimately we're trying to solve for is ensuring that as a local community, we do not have to support with tax dollars the healthcare system, that we ensure that the hospital has access to the capital that it needs to make $1 billion or more of investments over the next 10 years and ultimately to reach scale to deal with ever-increasing costs of health care. So the resolution, while it's framed resolution of intent to sell, does not mean that's the only option that can be explored. In fact, for the better part of a year, last summer, John and I were working extensively on looking at other models. In 2011, the hospital looked at a management agreement, and the decision was made that's not the right model for us. John and his team and our team last summer looked at, is there a new parent company that would allow for the headwinds that are coming to be somewhat mitigated? That solves part of the problem, but not completely. It doesn't answer the question of access to capital and the ability to reach scale. So we are always evaluating what the future may hold. And so we know based on the statute that it's a resolution of intent to sell, lease, or convey. Well, the option with what we know, with the work that we've done that gives the board the most optionality, is to ask them for the resolution of intent to sell. If it was just simply a modification to the lease, we could do that. We've looked at that. We've looked at a new parent company. I think everybody would agree the hospital is in fantastic shape. John will tell you that financially it's doing well. There is no need to simply convey title to some other organization to begin the operation. Those do not give us the optionality that let us plan for the long term going forward.
On the other hand, though, with the management agreement, which when that failed 4-1, mostly over concerns of losing local control. A management agreement seems like it would be much easier to get out of down the road if it just doesn't pan out in the way that you guys would envision or the way that the community wants the direction of the hospital. So on that side, that's kind of, that in terms of the future of local control, would that be a way to retain some of that and protect against future changes if if it doesn't go down the right path? Or is it just not worth the effort of doing that because there's no proceeds that would come from it?
I don't have the answer to that. I think we need to have the space to explore it, and that may well be what any number of proposers come back. But with a management agreement, and if the hospital needs access to $1 billion+ over the next 10 years, what are the conditions that would be written into a management agreement to ensure that those investments would actually happen, so that we could build a new cardiovascular institute? Whatever it is that the healthcare system identifies as the priority, we need to ensure that we align this system in a way to access the capital. It could be a management agreement. We don't know what a proposer might offer, but certainly what was presented in 2011 had limitations that the county commission was not comfortable in proceeding, and that was the right decision for the time. And whatever decision the board makes on September the 3rd will be the right decision for this community based upon what the board is hearing from lots of people with lots of opinions.
If I could, Vicki, just jump in on that. Chris is right. I mean, and a management agreement is one option. There are literally countless options that could be proposed, and structures and models that have varying degrees of each of the criteria that we're talking about. And each of those models has pros and cons. And again, back to September 3rd, that gives us the ability and is the only way to ask that question, to get that information in, to understand what are those various models that other health systems would be interested in partnering with us on. How do those look? What are they willing to commit to? Otherwise, we do not have that information to say, you know what? There is no model that gets us everything we want, so let's keep it the way it is. Or, wow, there's these 3 different models that we never even thought of or knew about, and let's explore those. Before we leave that question, you said something I just want to go ahead and touch on. Local control. That seems to be quite a topic. Healthcare is local. Healthcare is about local providers caring for local patients. At the end of the day, that's what healthcare is. One provider with one patient and having a very intimate interaction no matter what you're seeking care for. There are probably several providers in this room. I would venture to say they will tell you that local interaction, that local care episode, is way more impacted and influenced by the federal government, by the state government, by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, and by every other regulatory body that we have to deal with and all of the rules and regulations that they have to comply with than anything any of us do locally. And so healthcare is local, but we want to talk about where healthcare is being controlled. It's the federal government who pays 60% of the bill. It's the state government who pays 14 or 15% of the bill. It is the accrediting bodies who make decisions that impact that local care that's provided.
Okay, let's get to some more audience questions.
Next is Michael, table 51.
Good morning. So you were talking about business models, or well, the model of the hospital. But once the model of the hospital changes to a for-profit, then wouldn't that simply mean that they would do anything possible to increase profits over ethics?
Great.
Let me start by saying that the question should not lead to the assumption that any model that the board would choose would be to sell to a for-profit entity. That's not the discussion. What is very possible is that we would go through a process and find another not-for-profit to work with us. So I would ask no one to assume that this question leads to the end result of a healthcare system that is owned for a for-profit company. That's actually a small percentage of hospitals around the country that are for-profit owned, and that's not the question that we're asking the board to explore.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on that. In healthcare, there are two flavors, for-profit and not-for-profit. Not-for-profit, which is what we are, is 75% plus of all healthcare organizations, or at least hospitals and health systems. And so while there are for-profit systems out there, the vast majority of them are not-for-profit. Now, while we're on this topic, I know you've point blank asked me before in an interview, there are differences between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Let's just be candid. And it just so happened, last week I got a magazine. It's called Health Leaders Magazine, so a national publication in the healthcare industry. And there was an article in there about the differences between for-profit and not-for-profit health systems. So this was an outside, independent perspective. And they really looked at it from three perspectives. And they weren't saying one was right and one was wrong. They were saying both have their pros and cons, both have their business models, but there are differences. And here were the three key differences that article pointed out. The first was, Michael, to your question, really, I think, community emphasis versus community emphasis plus shareholders. And that is one of the major differences in a for-profit organization is while they would be trying to take care of the community, they also have to satisfy shareholders. And that is just the nature of being for-profit, where a not-for-profit really just serves the community. The community is their shareholder. The second is cost consciousness. Now, I'm not sure if this one is a positive or a negative, quite honestly, because when you look at the for-profit sector in healthcare, they are extremely cost conscious. They do consolidate back office functions. They leverage scale in a way that many do not and cannot, and therefore they drive a lot more cost out of healthcare. Some will tell you that is a good thing, that we need to drive more cost out of healthcare. On the not-for-profit side, it's not that we are not cost conscious. I think our organization is a good example of that. But not-for-profit organizations are more likely to make that decision to, well, let's not change that because even though it will save a little money, it might impact A, B, or C. And then the third area they talked about was the planning horizon. And I think this is a very important point and factor in this discussion because there's been a lot of talk about immediately taking profits out of the community and driving a return on investment and those types of things. which again, you're all very familiar with in the business world. So this article said there are very distinct planning horizon differences between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. For-profit organizations, it is next quarter's earnings. Right? If you are publicly traded, or if your company is publicly traded, your planning horizon is quarterly. And you are making sure you're hitting next quarter's earnings. Doesn't mean you don't make longer-term decisions, but they are all in the context of that planning horizon, where a not-for-profit organization or not-for-profit health system, as Chris mentioned earlier, we're taking a 52-year perspective. We've been here for 52 years. What about the next 52 years? And so the planning horizon and the decisions, therefore, that a not-for-profit can make and what they might be looking for is over a much longer period of time with much more of a community interest in mind. And so, to your question, it shouldn't be an automatic assumption, but let's be real. There are for-profit and not-for-profit organizations in healthcare, and that's at least one journal's perspective on the differences.
Okay, great. Rob?
Next question's Beth, table 17.
So if the resolution does demonstrate that our best option is to sell the hospital, how will this impact the different demographics that seek service at the hospital and the physicians group?
Great question. And so when we look at the different demographics, and I'm going to maybe assume your question is around charity care and access for everyone, regardless of ability to pay. It cannot, and under no circumstances would I ever recommend or support a recommendation that impacted or limited access for anyone in this community or that reduced the charity care we provide. New Hanover Regional Medical Center is on pace this year to provide $200 million in uncompensated care. That has grown dramatically over the years that I've been here. We are the safety net hospital for southeastern North Carolina. And so as we look at any proposal that comes back, no matter what the structure is, whether it's a sale, management agreement, doing nothing, anywhere in between, access and providing services for everybody, regardless of their ability to pay, have to be very important criteria in that process, because those should not and cannot be impacted from my perspective.
So when we talk about the RFP, if that goes forward after September 3rd, through the RFP, if it continues to contract negotiations, just this whole period of dealing with potential partners, buyers, parent companies, wherever you want to structure it. So you guys have talked in recent weeks about basically protections for certain things that are important to the system now, such as charity care, employee levels, not only not cutting those, but growing those, non-vested pension folks, what happens with that, services. So several things that it sounds like it would be very important, and you feel like you have the leverage because the hospital's doing so well to demand these types of things in negotiations. So, and one question I had was, how long can you include that protection? If you're looking, like you said, 50 years down the road, in perpetuity, I can't imagine that you can get someone to continue to uphold those things that you're able to ask them to do now.
That's a good question, a good observation. So let me talk a little bit about the process first. If, and this is a big assumption, if the board directs us to proceed on September the 3rd, the first thing that John and I would do, and it's called for in the resolution, is work together, work with the community to establish a partnership advisory group that's going to be made up of healthcare professionals, of folks from the hospital, folks from the county, community and business leaders. The intention of that advisory group is to actually begin the process of putting the request for proposals together that addresses what we need, want, and expect, and the protections that would be necessary for the foreseeable future in healthcare. So it's going to be that advisory group that actually puts the RFP together. But before we even get to releasing the RFP, The statute, which is what we're following, is going to require the county to have a public hearing so that the commission can hear what is important to the community. So there will be a public hearing before any request for proposal is ever issued. Based upon the Partnership Advisory Committee's work, that group, what the community says at the hearing, probably sometime in October, the RFP would be released, and I suspect, to be fair to everybody and to give plenty of opportunity for people to ask questions, hear and understand what's taking place, at least 60 days for that RFP to be out and released. We have, as the Partnership Advisory Group or the County Commission or the Board of Trustees, have to, at a minimum, identify who are the 5 partners that we, at a minimum, would like to send the RFP to. The Partnership Advisory Committee is going to really make that decision. Once those proposals come back, certainly there's going to be a staff evaluation and a Partnership Advisory Group evaluation. But more importantly, every one of those proposals has to be put out for public review. Everything that the proposer submits will be available, 100% of it, to this community to read and understand. If we get 1 proposal or 15 proposals, there has to be another public hearing on every one of those proposals so that the board can hear very clearly from the community, this is what we think. Yes, it's in keeping with the principles identified in the RFP, or no, it's not. And only at that point is it even possible that the commission may say, yes, there's something promising here. Partnership Advisory Group begin developing a contract or a letter of intent with 1 or more of the proposers. Only after they've been thoroughly vetted, the public has spoke to the content, can the commission ask us to actually develop a contract. If it gets that far, and the board may not like what it sees and the process is over then, but just playing out so that people understand what it would be going forward. If they say yes, develop an agreement with 1 or more of these, we will do that. We'll work hard, effectively, and well. But even those contracts, before they could ever be executed, have to be put out into the public square for the same evaluation, the same review by the community at large, and a public hearing as to, yes, as a county, as a community, we were successful in negotiating exactly what we said we wanted. You accomplished it, or no, you didn't. And then the board can make a final decision. So that's the process. This does not happen quickly. It will be very deliberate. It will be very open. It will be very transparent because the statute requires it. But more importantly, it's what our community deserves and expects. And as staff, we would absolutely make sure that everybody had that opportunity. As for, to your real question, how do we make these things binding in the agreement? That's why we can negotiate from a position of strength, why we've got incredible leadership on the Board of Trustees and on the executive team, why we've got great leadership with the County Commission, I think a high-quality county staff, and fantastic lawyers involved that will put together an agreement that is binding and ensures for us in the long term what it is we want and expect. And don't forget what the statute requires. The statute does not allow for a future owner of a public hospital to de-emphasize or roll back charity care. It cannot do, whether it's with a new partner in 5 years or 15 years or 20 years. The statute does not allow the hospital to retreat from the work that it is doing. So anyone who would enter into a contract is going to be held to working in a way that's consistent with the state statute. So that's how we're going to ensure for the next 52 years this community enjoys and receives the quality of health care in the investments in the healthcare system that it wants and needs.
I would just add to that maybe a different perspective. You're assuming, that question assumes
Sure.
nothing changes regardless. So no decision is a decision. And a decision to not move forward or a decision to not pursue a partner, even if we go through the process, is still a decision. And so what guarantees our charity care policy, our employee policy, or any of that doesn't change over the next several years? Nothing. It's a leadership philosophy that has those in place. Those weren't there 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And so we just need to keep in mind that while we definitely want to protect what we have, we want to see it continue to make sure all of those important factors are addressed. Nothing is forever.
Rob, let's take another question.
Paul, 17.
Yeah. My question gets to the issue of adding future medical services. The hospital's done a tremendous job in the last few years of really growing its cancer service. People who used to go away are now getting treatment here. John, I've heard you and Chris this morning mentioning adding a cardiovascular surgery capability, which would be a great additional medical service. What assurance do we have that an owner from Charlotte or Chapel Hill or Durham would choose to add services here, whatever the next service would be, rather than making us a feeder to the mothership, wherever that happened to be? And I understand somebody might come back and say, well, a contract, it could be in the contract. But what we're talking about is a business judgment. You know, it'd be a business judgment for the management of that organization to say this service should be here or there. And I don't think you can contract business management judgment away. So it would have to be something inherent in their business structure that would put the service here. And my fear is we won't get those additional services in southeastern North Carolina, but they'll be in the Triangle or the Queen City or some other place. How do we make sure we get all the stuff here that we'd like to have?
So great question, Paul. Thank you. You know, when you look at healthcare, I'll go back to where I started. Healthcare is local. First of all, I don't think that would be acceptable to our medical community. It's more than just the hospital. When you look at the physicians and the providers in our region, they want to make sure they have access and the ability to care for patients locally. It's really also just, when you look at our market, such a growing market, at this point seemingly an insatiable appetite for health services, back to your question, it makes business sense to place them here. People are going to take the path of least resistance for the most part. They're going to listen to their provider, and they're going to go and do what their provider tells them. And so the further away you put services, the more likely then those patients aren't necessarily, I mean, none of us are driving to Charlotte for a service. None of us are driving, to Winston-Salem or to Greensboro. I mean, unless it is a highly, highly specialized service. And so, when you look at just the healthcare industry, it makes tremendous sense to build and grow those services here locally. Anybody, I would think any health system would be looking at this market and understanding the need to grow those services in collaboration and partnership with our physicians to meet the local needs. And none of us want to travel any further than we have to, and that wouldn't change if somebody came in. And so, I think as we look at the growth and demand of services, it would make complete business sense, as well as just really what happens in healthcare, for those services to be located here.
Okay, great. Rod, do we have another?
Next is Tom, table 34.
Good morning. So I think we're all probably still waiting for our cell phone bills to go down, or cable bills, or whatever else as a result of the mergers that have happened in those industries. And certainly I think that the studies have proven to show that costs have gone up as a result of mergers as well, to both insurers and employers. Are there any assurances that you can give us that our local employers and our ratepayers wouldn't be paying a higher price as a result of any merger?
Fantastic question, and thank you for asking it, because this is really important to all of us, right? The cost of healthcare, as I started out by saying, is unaffordable and unsustainable for all of us. We provide healthcare. I am also the largest consumer of healthcare in the entire region. Last year alone, we spent $75 million on our own health care. Now let's talk about, so those studies, and you can Google them just as easily as I can. Those studies do say that typically, on average, generally speaking, in the mergers that they have looked at or consolidation that they have looked at, price has gone up. Now, what those studies also say is it depends. It depends on the size of the organization and the condition of the organization when it was acquired. Those studies also show, at least some of them show, that somewhere between a quarter and a third of those consolidations led to price staying the same or decreasing. Now, when you look at those studies, and I've looked at a lot of them recently, they're looking back at a time when fee-for-service was the only financial model in our industry. It is still the predominant model. So it's a time when cost shifting was the game in healthcare. You know, for years that was the big secret, right? Like you guys didn't know that because Medicare and Medicaid and others didn't cover our costs that we just increased the rates to commercial insurance companies. Well, that is going away. Nobody wants to pay that cost shift anymore. And so let's talk about price in healthcare, because this is a great question and a great point. 60% of my payer mix is Medicare. I'm not sure about you. If you've had any luck negotiating with the federal government, I'd like to talk to you afterwards. So my price is irrelevant to Medicare. 14% of my payer mix is Medicaid. Again, you don't negotiate with state government, and we know that 14% is being cut with managed Medicaid. Another 6% of my payer mix is self-pay or really uncompensated care. So that's 70% of my payer mix. That basically price is fixed. So the only ability we have is to negotiate with insurance companies. Well, in this market, Blue Cross Blue Shield has 84% market share of commercial insurance. Even more market share than we have locally. That makes them a monopoly. Ask any provider in this room, any provider you see after this, about the big raises they're getting from Blue Cross. Because it's not happening. And just like the federal government and state government, Blue Cross is transitioning as well. They are pushing their contracts to a value approach. Now, speaking of Blue Cross, so when you talk about price in healthcare and cost in healthcare, for most of us, for the most part, that's our insurance premiums. There are other costs, out of pocket and other things, but for the most part, the most direct cost all of us have is our healthcare premiums. It is a fact, documented fact, that providers, physicians, hospitals, every provider in southeastern North Carolina gets paid less from Blue Cross. We all get reimbursed less from Blue Cross here in southeastern North Carolina than our counterparts for the same care in Raleigh and Charlotte and Winston. Do you think your Blue Cross premiums are lower in southeastern North Carolina than they are in Raleigh and Charlotte and Winston? Absolutely not. We pay the same premiums right here in southeastern North Carolina that they do in those cities, but yet less money's coming here to providers for care locally. So if we want to start talking about cost in healthcare, we ought to start with Blue Cross. Because you're subsidizing care, I'm subsidizing care, every one of us who's paying a premium is subsidizing care around the state. Now, I'll get off that rant for a minute and say all of that aside, and the studies show this, and I think that is changing over time. All of that aside, that is not this medical community. This medical community is probably already one of the most consolidated medical communities you will find in the state and in the country. And so those studies say consolidated market bad, price goes up dramatically. I can tell you this medical community has been working on and thinking about cost and price for years. Emerge Ortho, Wilmington Health, New Hanover Regional Medical Center, just to name a few. Emerge Ortho did a bundled payment pilot to see how they could impact orthopedic care. Wilmington Health has been in Medicare shared savings for years, driving down cost and utilization amongst those Medicare beneficiaries, which translates over to other demographics and payer mix. New Hanover Regional Medical Center has been doing the same thing. And I'll give you just a couple quick pieces of evidence, and then I'll wrap this one up before the music starts playing. In 2017, New Hanover Regional Medical Center was named the #1 accountable care organization, ACO, which are the organizations who work on cost and quality value. #1 ACO in the state of North Carolina for quality, and #6 in the entire country of the 500 plus ACOs that participate in Medicare shared savings. Top 1%. We just got our 2018 results back. Yes, this is the federal government. We are in August. It takes that long. We just got our 2018 results back. We maintained that exceptional quality level, and we saved those 19,000 Medicare beneficiaries $5.5 million. We reduced the cost of care by almost 3%. So this medical community is already working on price and cost, and it is extremely important that that be a factor as we talk about any partnership, because increasing cost in this community is not something that will be tolerated by this medical community.
Okay, and I want to make sure we get to more questions too. If we
Next is Richard, table 43.
Thank you. First, let me say to John Gizdick, congratulations on those results from your ACO.
Thank you.
That just speaks volumes about
Well,
NHRMC.
Our providers and our staff who did it, I just get to tell the good news. Thank you.
I have a question about process. So first of all, the health NHRMC serves a 7-county area, maybe more. When Mission Hospital sold in Asheville to HCA, the proceeds were about $1.5 billion. The money was put into a foundation, and then the deal was reviewed by Attorney General Josh Stein, and he said, "Hold on, not good enough. This money needs to be spread around the 14-county region." Public statements here in our community have suggested that sale of the hospital would be a windfall for New Hanover County. But isn't there a likelihood that, just as in the Mission case, these proceeds would be spread around the region rather than concentrated here?
Richard, I'll answer that. That's a good observation, and actually a discussion that we had with a group just last Wednesday, I believe it was. And I'm speaking from Chris's perspective only, not at all for an elected official or the board as a whole. The taxpayers of New Hanover County 52 years ago put up the proceeds to build a world-class healthcare facility. We are not receiving direct inflow of cash from communities around us to support the healthcare system other than with their feet when they choose to do it. And so I don't know what the model of originally establishing Mission was in the western part of the state, but I don't know what the Attorney General would decide in terms of how to go about dissolving one nonprofit, creating some other organization with those proceeds to invest. I think we understand and realize this is a regional healthcare system, and the things that we do well in our community And the improvements that we make in our community are going to go out and have broad-reaching impact on the region as a whole. So I don't know what the Attorney General might require, but I do believe that the Attorney General would understand the balance of those investments have been made by this community, and so likely a balance of the reinvestment should be about improving overall quality of life here and looking at it on a regional basis. So can't speak for what the Attorney General would do. I think it's a good question, something that we've talked about.
I actually had a question also about the regional aspect of it. So I understand that it's a New Hanover County asset. The New Hanover County Board of Commissioners will be the one who ultimately approve or disapprove every step along this way. But in terms of input, so less than half of New Hanover Regional's business actually comes from within New Hanover County. I think John has mentioned a couple times. And it serves 7 counties in our area. So I'm just curious if you've had requests from input from these other 6 counties, particularly in Pender. Pender Memorial is not owned by an HRMC. It's on a 2-year lease, so they, I would think, would have a high interest in that community about who's going to take over in the future of that. But will they have any input on this partnership advisory group, or how are you going to incorporate that?
Let's begin by recognizing that Pender County has representation on the current Board of
Sure.
Trustees, and so their needs are reflected through the governance of the hospital on a daily basis. Certainly, I've had discussions with several managers in the region about what we're doing and why we are doing it. The thing that they have asked is that we remember it's a regional healthcare system no matter what the decision of the county commission is going forward. We will not lose sight of the fact that this is a regional asset that is owned by the taxpayers of New Hanover County. So there is representation for Pender. Spent the weekend actually with commissioners from Brunswick County and other parts of the state they have hospitals, but they are consumers of our services as well. And their emphasis has been, do not forget, this is a regional healthcare system.
How large is this partnership advisory group going to be? The advisory group that you assemble, if it moves forward after September 3rd, you mentioned a group of doctors, community members, business folks. How large is that group that's going to work on the RFP?
Have no idea how large that group is going to. It needs to be exactly the right size to make sure that it has representation from the community as a whole. It needs to be manageable. And I believe there will be groups established to advise members that are on the partnership advisory group. So to say that there's a predefined number, no. Who those would be, no. I think that's something, if we go forward, that John and I would talk with folks in the community. The advisory group itself, though, would be assembled in a way to be with this journey all along the way and would be critical and a major influencer and analyzer in terms of whatever recommendations come out of it. But I couldn't say to you what the size is going to be.
Yeah, Vicky, just
It'll be a public group as well. Every meeting will absolutely be part of the open meetings law as well.
Just kind of going back to the original question. And so we have relationships with many of the regional hospitals, and Pender being a very, very important relationship mutually for us. I would put that in perspective. And we're in constant communication. As Chris said, we have a Pender County Commissioner on our board. Happened to see him at a Pender School event just last week. Pender asked this question 21 years ago. So they get it. Brunswick Community Hospital asked this question a decade ago, 13 years ago. So I think when you look at, yes, those relationships are very important, and we can't forget about those, and we need to make sure, especially our relationship with Pender, is secured throughout this process. Many of those counties have done this very thing. They've looked to a larger partner for similar reasons that we're looking to a larger partner. They happened to do it 20 years ago.
Okay, we got about 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get some more audience questions in.
Good timing. Next question's from table 37, Frank Williams from Brunswick County Commission.
Oh, look at that.
Hello, Chris.
Commissioner?
We do have Commissioners Pat Sykes and Randy Thompson here as well, so this is obviously an important issue for Brunswick County. It is nice to be at an event where everyone's mad at a board that I am not sitting on. I will say that. I have two questions. One, you touched on the for-profit versus not-for-profit. So my first question is, have you given any thought to the pros and cons of affiliating with a university, specifically like East Carolina University, that's already Eastern North Carolina focused? Second question, Pender County sounds like already has representation, so yes or no question, will Brunswick County have a seat on that commission?
Let me begin to answer that and invite John to join in. I think affiliation with a university, the way we've talked about it, and I appreciate that after a community meeting last week, I had a wonderful discussion with a doctor who came up, and it was already part of the discourse, but it put a finer point that whatever the new model looks like, we've got to continue the outstanding work that's happening in the education and in the research base here. We need to expand on and grow the development of medical staff. And so what a partnership can bring to us as around physician development, more nursing development, research needs to be central to this RFP. So when we put that out there, it's impossible to predict who might propose and what they would bring forward. As it relates to Brunswick representation, John and I will talk about that and evaluate whether or not that is the right thing to do with the advisory group, or is there another model for us to seek and receive that regional comment. I appreciate you bringing that point up, though. It will be part of the discussion, which should be, Vicki, proof that we do not know who would be a member of this. It would be wrong for us to have already put this together not knowing what the county commission will choose to do. So there's a lot of work left to be done, and these kinds of meetings, community meetings, are how we will go about developing what the team and the content looks like.
Okay.
Got time for one more audience question coming from Greg.
Yeah, New Hanover Regional Medical Center and its foundations are very important to our nonprofit organizations throughout this region, and we want to thank you for that. Can you discuss what, if any, impact you would expect these nonprofit organizations to anticipate as a result of this process?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, because when we look at health and healthcare in this community, it's not just about New Hanover Regional Medical Center. It is about the many community partners and the rest of the medical community that accomplishes that. And so those partnerships are extremely important to us, and ensuring the continuity of those partnerships, because as we look at, again, when we talk about the future model of healthcare, and we talk about improving quality and reducing cost in healthcare, while I am proud of my organization and the exceptional care that this medical community provides, that only accounts for 20% of an individual's health status. 80% of every one of our health status has more to do with social determinants of health and the inequities they cause than the exceptional care we provide. Many of our community partners address those social determinants of health, whether it's food, education, housing, transportation, many other aspects. And so not only are those community partners important to us as an organization, they are important to the future health of this community. And I would want to make sure any partner or proposal recognizes the importance of community partnerships and working with community agencies to continue to advance the health of our region.
Good. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for your questions and bringing them forth. It's very obviously, as you all know, this is a very important discussion, and depending on what happens on September 3rd, possibly a continued discussion, where there'll be even more questions and issues to vet. So I want to thank everyone for your questions and bringing them. I want to thank the two of you for coming today and answering them for our audience. Rob's going to come up and do some closing remarks. And while he's coming up, I do want to mention, obviously the Business Journal will continue to cover this issue. And if you have letters to the editors, opinions, thoughts you want to share for or against, or questions to bring up, there's an email in your program. I encourage you guys to continue to be part of this dialogue.
If we could please first have a round of applause for our panel. And also give yourselves a round of applause for a good civil discussion and good questions. We always like to give our panelists reading assignments after coming to a power breakfast. So we thought this time, given what they're confronting here, a good book would be Leaders Eat Last, which is about how leaders create trust and cooperation to get the best results. So hope you guys enjoy the book. Thank you, everybody, for coming.